Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we have the second edition of our Hyped Up series, where we take a look back at a technology that got a lot of attention, but never really took off. This time, we're taking a look at 3D printing. Back around 2010, 3D printing was the big new thing. Back then, we were told that 3D printers were going to be the next PCs. There's going to be one in every household, printing out parts to repair your devices or toys or creating decorations on demand. There was also a vision for Kinko-style shops all through your neighborhood, where you can have physical products printed on demand rather than relying strictly on mass production. But none of that ever really happened, and we're here to explore why. Good morning, Dee. You ready to fire up your Thing-O-Matic and start making some prints today?
I remember the Thing-O-Matic. That was an interesting kind of kit. It reminded me of like the pre-Apple II PC kit days when people would get their kits and build their own PCs.
Yeah, I actually had a friend of mine's dad built one, and it was super cool to see it come together. And
yeah, I remember back then you were pretty into the 3D printing movement. I think you were getting a membership at that what was that location? I can't remember the name right now, where they had all the 3D printers and they had the ABS stuff and
yeah, I went and took some classes on 3D printing. One was like how to build a 3D printer. Second one was actually how to do the software, the CAD software, so that you can actually print your own parts. And that was actually the biggest eye-opening experience I have had, because the 3D printers that I was seeing pop up at stores like Best Buy and stuff like that, they were all like finely tuned, and they would sit there and print a part every day. But when I went and took that class at that shop, I realized that we spent half of the time trying to fix the 3D printer and get it to print when it jammed halfway through, than we did actually getting our print done. And it clicked in my head at that moment. I was like, oh, this stuff's really early. Like this, it just doesn't work as well as I was thinking it was going to work.
I think that was kind of the tale. It just, I don't know, the demand was fully there, and I felt it was a couple generations early.
Well, we got sold on this really cool vision. And the vision was, one day you would have this thing in your house. And let's say the foot on the bottom of one of your little tables from IKEA broke off or something. You go online, you click on that product, you click on 3D print, you click print. As long as you have your material inside of your 3D printer, suddenly it just starts printing the part. You take it off, take your little razor, clean it up a little bit, screw it back on, boom. Parts just been replaced. Nothing has to be mailed, nothing has to be made. And it seems simple in theory, but there's a lot of little things that happen between the point of clicking print and actually getting a part that's usable. It just hasn't got there yet. I'm going to say yet because honestly, like a lot of technology like VR and things like that, they keep circling back every 10 years. And they get better and better and better. And then there's this point where the ball gets pushed down the hill and suddenly, everything's rolling and things are, kind of moving along in the pace that we had hoped that they moved along. And I think 3D printers would get there, but I think we've taken a pause on it.
Yeah, I think that you look back on the history of how things get developed, things like smartphones, for example, and people forget how many kind of revisions and generations of smartphones that came out and didn't really work until the iPhone came out, right? We all remember like Palm Treos and Blackberries and all those things that didn't go out and get the experience right.
Well, I remember actually accessing a website on that flip phone that everybody had, the one that the clamshell
like the Razr
one. Yeah, it was like the Razr or something like that. Yeah, and you were able to like
StarTAC.
StarTAC, that was it. And you're able to like log into the internet. It was very strange. And then suddenly you can get a few things like a stock ticker or like sports scores or whatever. And I thought that was amazing. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like on the internet while I'm walking.
Yeah, I remember it was like, if you got the newer phones, you could maybe bring up a full desktop web page on a 1-inch by 1-inch monochrome LCD screen in your flip phone.
And we had a lot of,
wasn't quite what it needed to be.
It didn't, but it was weird because like I remember that time thinking like, oh, this is cool. One day it'll get there. And then suddenly they drop the iPhone and you go, oh, okay, this is where it was supposed to be. And that's kind of what I'm waiting for with the 3D printers is that
Yeah.
I see them. And every time I see one, I want to buy one. I'm like, I think I
Hmm.
want to get one of those. Like they'd be so fun. We could print toys in it and things like that. But where the rubber meets the road, and I know you're going to talk about this in a little bit, is getting something out of my head and actually print it on the printer is a
Oh yeah.
huge endeavor.
Yeah. So before we get into that, let's get a little bit of history going. So, 3D printing has been around and in use since the 1980s. Actually, the I think the first patent was actually filed in the 70s, but it didn't really get implemented, the concept, until the 80s. And it was used for things like rapid prototyping and automating portions of manufacturing, like sintering and some metalworking and stuff like that. Now, since the 80s, the process has been gradually improved, and companies have found it easy to employ and they've been using it for more applications, almost always within some kind of industrial situation or where they're automating something within a factory or like replacing workers with a machine that can do some spot welding or something like that. Right around 2010, 3D printing as a concept started picking up steam for the masses for consumer use, and there were companies like MakerBot were aggressively marketing 3D printers. First with the Thingomatic that we talked about, which looked like this kind of funky, steampunky, like homebrew kind of machine, and then after that they had the Replicator, which was much more streamlined and it was all metal and glass, and it looked like a finished product, and it looked like it was like inspired by the smartphone kind of industrial design. At the same time, you had like online repositories of CAD drawings from things like Shapeways and Thingiverse, and some of them you could order a product to be printed and finished and mailed to you, or you could download a CAD file and could maybe created by somebody else and print it out at home on your $1,000 MakerBot replicator or however much it cost at the time. I think Replicator 2 was more than that. Um, but within a few years, the consumer side of the business fell flat. And there's a lot of things that happened within there. Like MakerBot was kind of the leader within that space, the consumer space, and they went through a lot of things where they originally tried to be open source, and then they had to start trying to figure out how they could get some kind of IP protection, so switching out of the open source model because somebody else figured out a way to duplicate their technology and undercut them with cheaper manufacturing. And it just became a challenge, and eventually they got acquired by another company. And now, if you go and look at them, they are not really producing 3D printers for consumer use.
Yeah, and that's a disappointing thing. But I think it's because the industry realized that getting something like a 3D printer on everybody's desk would require a huge, huge endeavor. And also, there's more than just having the printer set up, right? You have to have the repository for the parts and the toys and the things like
Mm-hmm.
that, right? And then there was this interesting lawsuit that happened. I don't know if you remember this. It was like 2010, 2011. A company, if I recall, basically said, well, what happens if someone just takes something that I've created? So let's say you create a little toy and then they
Mm-hmm.
scanned it and put the CAD up. Can someone else sell the CAD and then allow people at home to basically print those toys at home because you're actually not replicating the actual product itself. You're just selling your version of its design.
Yeah.
It was
So if
very
somebody, for
complicated.
example, makes like some kind of a sculpture at home and somebody else does a 3D scan of it, a laser scan of it, and converts it into a CAD drawing and then claims that it's theirs, like how do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to it. And there was this other dream that everyone had, and it was that, let's say you and I are talking to each other, we're in the process of building something, we work on different sides of the country, that I'd be able to take this prototype that I had or this idea I had, I'd put it inside of my 3D printing box, it would scan it, and then it would print on your side exactly what I had sitting on my desk.
Yeah.
And that didn't pan out very well either because it's very complicated to do. But I kind of wanted to circle back just for a second here before you kind of get into the CAD stuff and talk about Thingiverse and Shapeways. So I'm very familiar with these sites because I went and played around with them a lot, probably about 5, 6, 7 years ago, mostly when they were kind of at their height. The great part about these sites is that the parts that are on them have already been printed and tested. So that's what a lot of people who talk about, I just need the CAD drawings. Well, yes, there's the drawing, but then there's also like what type of material are you using to print? They kind of tell you like, oh, this is best to print on SLA versus some other type of plastic or carbon fiber. They also have tested wall thicknesses. So this is a problem that happens all the time when people are building parts, is that they'll build something and then they'll make the wall thickness too thin, and then you'll
Mhm.
be playing with the part or using the part and then it'll break, right? Cool part about the stuff that's uploaded on these sites is that in many cases they've been printed many, many times and revisions of the CAD have been done many, many times.
Mhm.
So that is a big, huge component. Having those sites exist and be available and be a repository for companies to put their parts in there and stuff in order to even get this industry off the ground.
Yeah.
Because you get very bored just printing free things that you find online. You want to be able to use this 3D printer as a tool. So I'm very bullish on those type of companies because they're actually doing, in my opinion, the very hard work of ensuring that the parts are going to be printed properly and are going to work well. And then telling you also which 3D printers work best for that part. Sometimes it'll say on there works best on the MakerBot replicator, or works best on this other one coming out of MIT. That's starting to get worked out, which makes me actually think that there's promise for this revolution of having one of these on everybody's
I
desk.
don't know, dude. I hear you saying all these things, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of stuff to think about for a end user consumer at home who
Well, it is.
isn't like one of us and isn't used to just doesn't want to have to do all the work of figuring out which part they need to get, or they just want the thing. Just give me the thing.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's like a small step forward because
Hmm.
it's already challenging to handle a standard printer that prints ink, right?
Hmm.
So for these industries, I think to step over that line, we need time, basically. You need years and years and years of working out all these details. But I see the
Yeah.
software side getting worked out a lot faster, it seems like, than the hardware
I don't
side.
know, dude. I think all right. Well, let's get into this a little bit. So, why didn't 3D printing take off? Why didn't it become mainstream? Why isn't my mom just printing out uh, tools and stuff that she wants to use in the garden from her replicator sitting next to her microwave? And part of that is before you even get to the printing part. So a lot of this, what we're going to talk about is the experience, and what you kind of described with shapeways and stuff is like, it still kind of touches on these things that are difficult within the experience. So the first part is before you even get to the printer, the CAD is hard. I mean, if you want to be a creator, if you want to create something and you're working from scratch, CAD is challenging, right? People take uh, they study these CAD drawings for years. People who would do it professionally, they specialize in certain things. It's not the same thing as just writing up a Word doc and printing it out.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, we have friends that are professional industrial designers, right? And we've
Yep.
literally sat in rooms with them for months on end watching the constant revision of these CAD files. It's like,
Yep.
oh my gosh, right? It's exhausting. And I've even asked them, I said, can you scan it? And they're like, hey, yeah, you can scan it. And then once you scan it, you got to go back and clean up every line and check everything. Otherwise,
Hmm.
it won't be perfect.
Yeah. And if you miss a seam that isn't closed, or if you have something colliding with another thing, or anything could throw off your CAD drawing so that your part doesn't come together.
Yeah.
And even if you're downloading a file from somewhere, you talk about Shapeways and Thingiverse and how they've been able to refine those CAD drawings over multiple revisions. Well, somebody had to do that work. Somebody had to go in and take a look at it. It's probably spent hours and hours looking at this CAD drawing. Maybe they did a test print, figure out what was wrong with it, go back through it, make the changes, go do the same thing over again, another round of revision, looking at the CAD file, maybe doing a test print, figuring out what was wrong, then making another change, and then again and again and again. It's a challenging process that makes sense for professionals or enthusiasts, but for somebody who doesn't want to have to go through all that and just wants the thing, it's way too much work.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it really is. I mean, it's kind of fun a little bit, like if it's become like this
Mhm.
challenge, for your brain. But if you're just like quickly I need that part, yeah, it takes time, right? And if it's not done right, you get frustrated, and then you just end up going and buying it anyways.
Yeah, and people like us, for us, we're like, oh well, it's fun. You're going in there, and you're making something, but not everybody does that. That's not everybody's idea of fun.
Yeah.
And we're used to that. We're in the industry. We work with industrial designers. We're always thinking about how products and with hardware and software and everything else can be designed and built. And we're used to tinkering, but there's plenty of people who do not. And I think that was a challenge with getting into a mass market. Beyond the CAD, there is still a significant amount of study and knowledge you need to get in order to make the right decisions when it comes to 3D printing. There's so many different approaches to 3D printing. You have things like stereolithography, digital light process, multi-jet fusion, polyjet, direct metal sintering. There's many more. And a lot of them have strengths and weaknesses in different areas for different things. Like with like you said with Shapeways or Thingiverse, it'll tell you in the CAD, all right, this is the 3D printing approach that is best for this part. Well, for me, if I'm just a consumer and I want the thing, and maybe I have a 3D printer, and I look at it, I'm like, that's not the 3D printer that I have, but I still want the thing. Then, I mean, people aren't going to go out and buy another like $2,000 printer in order to print out this different kind of thing. It creates a certain amount of fragmentation within the experience. Like you spend thousands of dollars on this stuff for you to go on Shapeways and look at all the things that you still can't print.
Yeah, and some of the feedback I've gotten from enthusiasts that ended up buying a printer and then go to Shapeways and Thingiverse is they said for about 3 months they had a lot of fun like downloading things and printing them, and then
Mm-hmm.
after they got past that to the point where they wanted to like take something out of their head and print it, that's where it all fell apart. Yeah, so basically like the idea of printing other people's stuff is really fun and exciting, and then once you're like, now I want to print my ideas, it just all falls flat.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine if you were somebody who is an enthusiast and you have this idea for something that you want to create, right? Maybe you're a sculptor or some kind of a 3D artist, and you buy what everybody's telling you is the latest and greatest 3D printer, and then you go through and you learn CAD, you take the classes, you study, you practice, then you develop your sculpture in CAD, whatever you're developing, and then you get to the point where you're printing it out, and you find out, oh crap, I've got the wrong type of printer for this thing that I've wanted to make for the last year or two.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
That has got to be deeply frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it live
Yeah.
of the industrial designers we work with getting extremely frustrated when things aren't working and it's taking a lot of time. And then they make the prototype and we've gone back and actually said, okay, well, how many hours actually got put into this? And it was like 10 times the amount of time it would take to source the part basically and purchase it.
Yeah, and then you also have to deal with the different types of resins, metals, plastic, carbon fiber, all the different types of materials, and some of them will work with certain types of printers, and some of them won't. So all of this is just when you start thinking about a typical consumer who isn't their life doesn't revolve around tinkering with tech, then it's just still the barrier to entry is just way too high for them.
So it's no longer a set it and forget it experience. It's basically like set
Yeah,
it, test it, play with it, break it, forget it, give up on it, and, and then you know what I mean.
yeah,
And I want it to be a set it and forget. You know me, I'm bullish on like
yeah.
getting this thing on my desk and being able to do that. And I've wanted it for 10 years, 11 years, and it still hasn't shown up yet. Um, Even with all the consolidation with all the companies, purchasing one another and bringing all their technology together and their IP and all that kind of stuff, I have yet to find one that can get me there. But then I realized something the other day as you and I were prepping for this and talking about it, was that really the way to do this, and it's not going to be as exciting for the consumer, but you can make it work, would be to make this a closed experience, right? So, for
Mhm.
example, you buy a 3D printer, it has software that's associated with it, and it has a marketplace associated with it, and the marketplace only has product in it that will print perfectly on your 3D printer. So you basically close the whole experience up so that it's not as
Yeah,
broad and just say, this is how it works.
yeah.
This is what you use it for.
Yeah, I think that would help quite a bit with a lot of the a lot of the experience prior to the printing, but we also haven't yet gotten into the printing and post printing experience yet. So there's more to come. But yes, I think that is the way to go. I think that's the kind of thing that Apple would do is like, here's your Apple 3D printer. Here's your library of things. We're only going to show you things that work for your printer. And that's it. And maybe we'll tell you what kind of filament you can use. And we're only going to make maybe one or two types of filament to use. And maybe those are both installed into your machine, and the machine intelligently selects which one based on the file itself.
Yeah.
So that I think is part of the pre-printing experience that can really get figured out.
Maybe that's the solution. And then you just do very incremental upgrades.
Well, so let's get into what comes after that. So I remember when I was first learning about it, and I remember I believe one of the executives, maybe it was the CEO, went on like the Colbert Report with his 3D printer,
Uh huh.
and they were talking about it. And I remember thinking, okay, well, it takes a few hours. You just let it run and go do your thing and come back later, and it's done. And what I found out was it was not. You could not just set it and forget it. You had to watch it in case there was some kind of a problem during the printing, or if you saw it like start to mess up or any kind of thing. You kind of have to. It might take 8 hours to print, and you kind of have to sit there and watch it while it's being printed. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's changed. You have any
It's
knowledge
kind of
around that?
changed a little bit. I mean, I think some of the newer ones do send you notifications, like if something's going on with the printer, so you don't have to like sit and stare at it the whole time. But yeah, it is one of those things. Like, well, I guess the question would come back to this: if you wanted to start it and then go to bed at night, are you? I'm asking you, D. Like, are you okay if you wake up in the morning, the whole thing's a huge mess, and you wasted a lot of your material?
I mean, it kind of depends on how much it costs, how much the material costs, how much energy it's taking. If like the other thing is these things get hot, so I'm hoping that it's like safe and not a fire hazard. I don't need a specific location in order to keep it away from anything flammable or anything like that. Those are things that I'm thinking about. But if the filament's cheap and it's easy to get and it's like paper, like
Yeah.
with our paper printers, I keep coming back to kind of the paper printer experience a little bit. Then it's not a big deal for me. I would just also need to be cognizant um, of just time. Like if this was something I needed for like a kid's birthday or something, and now I'm like, okay, now I don't have anything to give him, and his birthday's later today, then that would be a challenge. The other thing is if I tried that multiple times and it just happened every single time, I would just be like, all right, well, either this thing doesn't work or I can't do that set and forget a thing because it's just going to be a big mess every single time.
Well, and that's the challenge with all technology, right? Is that we've
Mm-hmm.
learned as being people who study user experience for the last 20 years is that after a couple times of something not working, people just don't come back,
You know,
right? They just kind of disappear from it, or they return it, or they let it sit in the garage, and then they tell a really terrible story to other people, and those people don't buy it, and then there's a spiral, and then suddenly the product just doesn't exist anymore,
yeah,
right? And we see that all the time.
yeah, and it speaks a little bit to reliability because I remember when the hype was really going and you were really into it. I was pretty into it. I was really intrigued and hoping for like the vision to come to pass. But I spent one afternoon just fighting with my just home office paper printer for like a couple hours, trying to get something scanned and then printed. Because let's face it, printers are terrible. Like the paper printers are terrible. And I remember thinking to myself, there's really no way that a much more complicated version of this experience is really going to go mainstream. That was my moment when I realized, okay, we can't seem to get it right for just printing words on paper. So how are we going to get it right for something way way more complicated?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a lot of the chat channels and stuff, and people talking about printers and everything, one of the things that comes up all the time is people say like, "Oh, I wish Apple," Apple enthusiasts, right? People who are all Apple, they always go,
Mm-hmm.
"I wish Apple would just make their own printer so I could stop dealing with all these problems." And
Yeah.
I know where that's coming from. That's coming from because I have different branded printers here, and I use two different machines. So like I
Hmm.
use Windows and Apple, right? And so when I go to print on the Apple one, from the Apple machine, because it the newest version automatically detects the printer and all that kind of stuff, it seems to be okay. But in the past, I'd have like an old printer, and then I'd try to print and it can't find it, and it doesn't know why. And then I'm looking it up and it says like, oh, use air this, and like, try plugging it into the wall. And it's like a huge issue. And I'm like, what year is this? Right? Like, didn't we
Yeah,
start creating printers like in the 70s and 80s? And here we are in 2021, and we can't even get a regular printer working. So I do understand where you're coming from. Like, if you can't get the basic stuff working, then how are we going to get this super
yeah.
complicated stuff working?
Well, I feel like this is like 3D printing and just 3D printers in general need that Apple style approach of like, let's just make it work. This isn't really something I want to tinker with. This isn't like, I'm not going to go in and mess around with it too much like I would with like a gaming PC or something. I just want it to work and I want it to work reliably. Now, I will take notice of the fact that I think one of Apple's greatest strengths is being able to select what projects they want to work on.
Yeah.
And if they, it seems to me that if they don't feel like they can deliver that Apple quality of experience, they don't dive in, right? That's why
Yep.
there's ultimately a relatively limited number of products, hardware products that Apple produces.
Yep.
And then I'll take note that there is not, to this day, despite the fact that you can make the argument that printers from HP were kind of one of the things that kicked off the Silicon Valley technical revolution. They still don't have a printer. There is still not an Apple printer. I would totally buy an Apple printer or something that worked like an Apple printer and just use that, so I don't have to keep messing around with the printers that are out there. I look at that and think to myself, like, maybe there isn't because they haven't figured out a way to smooth out the experience and make it work really, really cleanly.
Well, I think if Apple looked at it, they tend to come in a lot later on things. I think that
Well,
they
later on
would.
things. I mean, when was the printer first come out? Like the paper
No, no,
printer,
no.
like
I mean,
70 something?
what I mean by that is like when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
3D printers, like
Yeah.
they would kind of want to see probably people like clamoring for 3D printers. And right now,
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard the word 3D printer mentioned, and I'm inside of like a big circle of tech people in probably four
Yeah.
years.
I mean, I hear it, but um, I think to some extent, I'm hearing it from different people than you might be. So there was one other part of the experience that I wanted to touch on, and is if it is kind of the post printing experience. And let's say you got the CAD and the CAD worked well, you had the right printer and the right material, it all printed out okay, whether you were watching it or you were able to walk away and got lucky. You didn't have a jam or anything that was going on, and you got your printed out product. You're not done. You don't have your thing yet most of the time. So there's still usually you got to take it, you got to sand it or file it, you've got to finish it, you've got to maybe either gluing together multiple parts or assembly in some way, and then you got to paint it so that it's not just some monochrome piece of ABS or something like that. And so that's usually like there's still potentially hours of work to do after the printing is done in order for you to have a finished product. And I think that's the kind of thing that again, not a lot of mainstream consumer use are going to be willing to do.
I think what if you're going to sell something and you want in the 3D printing space and you want to be successful, it's got to be a fully closed, perfectly running system, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
like let me give you a great example. Just this year, I tested out a new Wi-Fi network at the house,
Mm-hmm.
and it was seamless. It
Yeah.
found every detail for me. It inputted every detail. It was the user experience was so easy, and it just worked. Prior to that, I've always had little issues where I'm like, oh, I got to log in. I got to figure out whether it's WPA or this and that. And I was like, stop it. Like nobody understands any of that stuff unless they want to like hunt it down and look it up. Just make it work. And it
Yeah.
and it worked, right? And 3D printers have to be the same way. You have to be able to just say, you plug it in, you click print, it works 95% of the time.
Yep.
That's it.
You,
It's over with.
yeah.
Otherwise, it's not going to take off.
You click print, maybe you walk away for a couple hours, you come back and it's done and you're happy. And it's getting the experience kind of needs to be The experience of taking finished print out of your 3D printer kind of needs to be the same as like an unboxing experience.
So where are we now? Like, let's fast forward. You were talking about, 2010 to, basically 2016, 17, when things
Yeah.
were really starting to get hyped up and excited and stuff. So what's the current data?
So I was actually surprised when I dug into this, but we're actually seeing the 3D printing market continue to grow.
Oh,
So
good.
in so in 2019, the 3D printing industry grew to 10.4 billion, according to a website that focuses on manufacturing methods, AMFG.
Uh-huh.
And there was a dip in 2020 because of the pandemic.
Sure.
But since then, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen many of the 3D printing manufacturers, people who develop the machines, they are they are reporting substantial growth, and in some cases, record growth.
In
And one of the
where though?
reasons,
Like, what segment?
well, it's all in kind of industrial manufacturing machines. So what's happened is it's all in industrial sections. Is that they 3D printing machines? If you go and look at MakerBot now, or the company that purchased it, if you go look in their websites, they're all producing these industrial manufacturing 3D printers that you buy for thousands of dollars and you set it up in your factory and it prints parts for you.
Okay.
And one of the things that they found, also in an article in the AMFG, is the latest round of growth coming out of the pandemic has been 3D printing machines being used to kind of plug holes in manufacturing capacity that's been brought on by the pandemic. So you can't run, for whatever reason, certain manufacturing processes because of pandemic conditions, but you're able to print those same things and
Yeah.
keep production going.
If you look at a lot of these even smaller shops, right? Like I've heard that like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these custom motorcycle shops and custom bike shops and stuff are starting to buy 3D printers that to produce parts, and then they hire one person that basically handles all the CAD and all the printing on a regular basis. I did hear that was kind of on an uptick. Like it was worth the investment because they can sell their own parts to their customers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming they're kind of talking about that as well, right?
Yeah, I believe so. So these could be in custom shops, things like that, where you can get a part printed or a custom piece made that can go on to whatever it happens to be. And it seems to me as though if we think back to pre 2010, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where 3D printing was being used as a rapid prototyping or an automation method within factories, that despite all of the consumer attempts to make it really mainstream, that industrial application has just continued forward, and they've continued refining, and they've continued to get better and better.
Hmm.
One thing that did come out of that 2010 consumer push is that you have some niche enthusiast markets like cosplayers and people who are into like custom mechanical keyboards. They're leaning hard into 3D printing, and you're seeing people 3D print things that will go into a cosplay costume, like somebody making like a full like Iron Man costume or something like that out of 3D
Hmm.
printed materials. Or you're seeing them kind of 3D print like frames or keycaps and things for their keyboards. And there's probably other things that I'm not aware of. Maybe like in the audiophile market, people are making like custom headbands or something like that. But they're using 3D printing as a process to do that. But
Hmm.
those are, if we think about all of the UX stuff that we went into about like people aren't going to want to do this and people aren't want to do that, within enthusiast markets, people who enjoy the work itself, this is really kind of taken off.
Yeah, I have a friend who has it's not a 3D printer, but it's a laser wood carver.
Mm,
You know how you drop in the CAD
yeah.
file, put a piece of wood in there, and then it'll
So
use a laser.
CNC laser cutter.
Yeah, and
Mm,
it's a desktop unit, and that really impressed me a lot. And I asked her, I said, "Hey, does this thing break a lot or anything?" She's like, "Nope, not at all." She's like, "As long as you get your CAD file put in there," and she's like, "There's some really great software because everything that's being printed is printed in 2D, really, right? Because you're basically
yeah.
laying a piece of wood down and just carving it out." And she was like, "It works really, really well." And I remember thinking to myself, like, that's actually a really good example of where we can get with the 3D printers, because it's such a refined experience where you're just
Yeah.
carving images out of wood, and it could be as intricate as you want, and you only have one tool to do it, which is basically the little laser cutter, and it's in a box, and it's a fixed size, and it works. She said rarely ever has a problem. She's like, I print stuff for everyone on the street. Um,
Yeah.
that's like a great example of where it can get to, when it comes to the home use. But the fact that people are starting to buy those so they can make stuff at home is kind of promising. But I'm happy to hear though that like the industry is basically quietly growing.
Yeah. So it seems like the mainstream consumer market went dormant at a certain point when everybody realized, okay, this is not really ready for prime time. But the technology has continued to grow and it's continued to refine, kind of boosted by industrial applications and kind of these enthusiast markets. And it does raise the question of what does the future hold?
Yeah, exactly. Like, where is it going to go? Let's talk about our predictions. Let's really get into that. So, taking an open mind of the fact that it has been slowly growing, and the actual printers are getting better, and they're getting more refined, and they're finding their home in these different industries that need them. And I know it's not necessarily like in your house, but do you think like we could get there in the next 5 or 10 years to the point where you'd go over to a Best Buy or go online and just buy a printer and suddenly you're using it at home?
I mean, I really don't think in 5 or 10 years, like I look through that laundry list of kind of UX challenges to kind of the mainstream consumer, and I'm like, God, this is so much. This is so much to handle. And I think from a CAD perspective, from the software perspective, it needs to be at like where back in the day we used to code our own websites with HTML and maybe some CSS, eventually some PHP in, and now you have websites that basically you drag and drop what you want your website to look like, and then you have it them coding the front end for you. That's
Hmm.
kind of where I think the CAD needs to get to. So there's a lot of things that needs to be done in order for it to get there. But at the same time, I think about the value that it could provide, and what comes into my head? Star Trek: The Next Generation and their replicators and the tea Earl Grey hot. And I think to myself, that experience is so magical that I can't see it not coming to fruition someday in some fashion.
I will say, I think that the first step on the consumer side is probably that Kinko's model that we talked about early on. The reason is because if you purchase something from Shapeways or one of those places, what's to say that they can't have a direct link, or maybe they do, and I haven't checked recently, but a direct link to the closest 3D printer to where you live. And
Yeah,
you just click print, and then it'll tell you when to pick it up. And then places like Kinko's and other business services places like that, they can just have a specialist there, and that's all they do. I mean, there's people who love doing this stuff and like tinkering
yeah,
with this stuff, right? And a print comes in, they look at it, make sure everything looks cool, and then they print it, and then you go pick it up. I mean, that's essentially what we did when we were creating our prototypes for our product. There was a great place not far from our office where we would send all our designs in, and then they would look at them and they would give us suggestions, and then they would edit them a little bit. And then they would start them on their printer, and they would give us a time when we can come pick it up. Like, oh, like it should print in a day or two, whatever. And it was really neat, but you really needed that specialist to be there. And I feel like that's like the first step is like getting that smoothed out. And then the second step is like, okay, try to do this at home.
yeah. I feel like that's kind of an evolution of the manufacturing process, where one of the big advantages you don't necessarily have to sit on all that inventory, right? So I could picture like Amazon fulfillment centers having a section of 3D printers for producing some subset of products at the fulfillment center and then just dealing with the last mile to get them to you,
Yeah.
rather than having to store all those different products. Of course, that does seem like a very Amazon thing to do, right? Because they're just obsessed
Yeah.
with like hashing out all the logistics. So I think that could be an application. There's another thing that kind of struck me when I was thinking about the creative side of this, especially for anybody who's developing the CAD. I feel like the rise of NFTs could help improve things for anybody who's creating CAD drawings. And you can imagine somebody creating like let's say an awesome CAD sculpture of like Wolverine or something like that. And then he just tags it with an NFT. And now anybody who wants that awesome sculpture can just purchase the NFT itself or some kind of a copy through a smart contract or something like that, and then have access to that sculpture.
That's really interesting. Yeah. You never know what the tipping point's going to be for certain technology. Sometimes it's other technology pushing that technology into a certain direction.
Yeah.
And you're right, right? So someone looks at it and says, "Oh, I really love this," and they say, "Oh, purchase a physical version," and then boom, suddenly it's printed. Though, the one thing we haven't really talked about is that when you 3D print something right now, the quality of the print isn't fantastic in most cases. I'm sure there'd be some people that would be like, "Wait a minute, if you're printing in metal, you can get a really great quality piece of something out of it." But a lot of the things that get printed, you kind of have to sand them a little bit, to kind of smooth them out. The painting's not done yet, so you usually have to paint it unless you like the color of the filament that you're using. So, for example, if you're going to do Pikachu, one of the Pokemon, then you get the yellow and let's say print it in yellow, but like what about the detail work, right? So the
Yeah,
quality
that's a
is a
good
little
question.
different. So it's like good for like I said, like a plastic screw that you need to put on the bottom of like a piece of furniture. Or I actually saw somebody do something really interesting. They had a hole in the side of their wall, brick wall on the outside of the house, and they actually 3D printed a fake brick and then slid it in there. And not to say they couldn't just chip it all out and put another brick in there, but it was just the concept or the idea that like if you make it look right, you can kind of slip these plastic inserts into different places, and having a 3D printer kind of helps with those types of applications.
Yeah, it's great for things that are like, I mean, especially for things that are kind of one-off, custom, specialty things within an instance.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think this is a wrap for today's hyped up episode. That was kind of fun. I mean, we did a lot of reading. You did a lot of head down research on this, just to even kind of like wrap our head around what's been going on. Because crazy, we were so into this in 2010, and then until you mentioned it last week, I completely forgot about 3D printers. Like it really has kind of fallen to the wayside in my brain. And now I'm kind of bullish on going back and staying on top of it again. But, sometimes the future just takes its sweet time to kind of bring things to the market. I mean, if you look at the Apple Newton, it was kind of the beginning of the iPhone to some extent, but it wasn't until 2007 that we actually got the iPhone. So I think we need to be open minded on 3D printers for the future. I think there's a lot of great stuff in the pipeline, but it just might take a lot longer than we anticipated. I want to thank everyone for listening all season long. We have been cranking out these episodes every week, trying to bring you really good content, help you kind of rethink about different products and industries and services, and also learn how we think as user experience people about a problem, right? And then it all comes back down to adoption. It all comes back down to having a great experience that people love. Well, they will spread the word of mouth. It's easy to use, like those types of things. And we keep circling back on that on purpose because we want everyone who listens to get really kind of into the idea that if you create something amazing for people and you stay on top of it, you can do really well. So once again, I want to thank everyone for this season. Demetrius and I are going to take a little break. We'll be back with season 4 closer towards the end of the summer, our summer. And then we will have some great guests and some new topics to dive into. We'll be posting links to many of the sources that we referenced on Twitter, just as we always do. You can follow us on Twitter at the X Podcast 1. That's the X Podcast number 1. If you like this podcast and found it interesting or informative, it helps us a lot if you subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, anything of that nature. So thank you all so much, and we will see you all in season 4. Have a great rest of the summer. Bye.